welcome to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. In this episode, I'm talking to Gareth Birkett and Simon Mcmurdy, both dads to children with life-limiting conditions and special needs, and they share their stories and how they bonded over a similar lived experience. So, welcome to Gareth and to Simon. So, let's start off, perhaps if you could explain, how is it you know each other?
So, bizarrely, Simon and I used to work together a long time ago. And I guess I changed companies and moved on and was doing other things with my working life. And I happened to be in a hospital with William. And I was walking down one of the corridors in the John Radcliffe Hospital. And Simon works in the hospital still. And I bumped into him in a corridor and was just like, oh, kind of what are you doing here?
Yeah, it was just one of those chance meetings, really. I thought, there's a friendly face. I recognised that chap. And we stood in the corridor and we had a good old conversation and catch up, really, didn't we? And I think the immediate bond that we had was obviously the common ground, if you like, of being dads to children with special needs. In my case, my daughter Olivia, who'd sadly passed away by the point that we spoke. She passed in 2016, but I could see that you were there, attending probably one of many outpatient appointments that were very familiar to me in my journey. And it just seemed, totally appropriate to kind of hook up to you and catch up and find out where you were and what your journey had been so far, really. So, yeah, it was a long time ago.
And so you bonded, I guess, over similar shared experience. How did you find that, your experiences were similar?
Well, I think, from anybody that's got or has dealt with a child of any age, really, with a special need, you immediately kind of form that sort of superhero club, as I call it sometimes. There is a special set of skills that you take on to deal with that, really. And I've got sort of utmost admiration for anybody that I meet on my travels that, have got responsibility for dealing with a child with any form of disability or special need, really. Having been there, done it and got the T-shirt, it kind of makes you realise what these people have to cope with above and beyond normal life, really.
I think you kind of morph into this strange situation where there's a lot of unsaid things that are just known. You spot things that you just would never have spotted before you existed in this realm with, operating within special needs world and in a medical setting. You just simply don't experience or know anything about those. But then when you have done it and you bump into somebody, although Simon and I were catching up and talking about things, we instinctively just already knew so many of the things that didn't need to be said because we both know we'd been there before. And it is a strange little club that you join where you just spot and experience things that you just wouldn't ever have any idea about if you hadn't lived it.
So for people listening who, don't have a lot of experience in that world, can you just elaborate on, from a day-to-day basis, what does that mean?
Yeah, I'll go first. I mean, my story really began with my daughter Olivia, who was born back in the summer of 2012. My wife and I decided to start a family. I'd got a stepson who was 6 or 7 years old at the time. We got married a few years before and decided to have a baby. Everything was going swimmingly well until the point of delivery, at which point it all went pear-shaped. And Olivia was starved of oxygen at birth and had a very difficult delivery. And it's kind of not the journey that you ever expect or anticipate, I suppose, from the kind of, the glossy world of having a young family and, bringing a beautiful child baby back home. So from our point of view, it was a very much a sort of dark time. We spent the first few weeks in hospital with Olivia, having had a very sort of traumatic birth. She was rushed straight away from us into a neonatal intensive care unit and, given an MRI scan within a few days to try and determine the effect of this oxygen starvation that she'd had. We were sat down, about 7 days, I think it was, after the results of this MRI and told that they'd found something they weren't expecting to find, in that her brain had been not formed correctly during the pregnancy and during the birth and so on, and that she would be severely disabled and life limited, probably unlikely to reach her first birthday. And that was quite shocking news for us to have to take in, really. So, from that point forward, we were we were on a sort of very uncharted path, if you like, not what we were at all expecting. And we had to adapt all aspects of our life, really. We're pretty competent people, and, we were kind of sent home, it felt, without any real support or direction other than just, go home and enjoy your daughter and get on with it, really. And I was just looking back at some of the timeline of some of the events that took place, first health visitor coming into the home on the, the sort of visit when you get the community midwife coming round, not having had any knowledge that we'd had a difficult birth, really, and being as sort of shocked as we were at what had happened. And, going through that first sort of few months, really, having to adapt to life around a baby that was needing, extra care with feeding, all sorts of aspects. She was having seizures. Life was just not normal in any way, shape or form, really. From our point of view, we just adapted to life. We were coping. We'd both taken time out from work and had been supported by our employers to just do what we needed to do, really, to steady the ship. But it wasn't really till, probably for us in particular, probably about 12 months before we got some form of social care support. By this point, we'd adapted the front room to become a sort of converted bedroom so that one of us could stay up with her through the night to help with her feeding. She was being fed through a nasal gastric tube, NG tube, having seizures, and so on and so forth. And it was then a journey of referrals through various sort of specialist hospitals, trips down to Great Ormond Street in London, genetic testing, all sorts of stuff that was being investigated. We found out she was blind, she had difficulty swallowing, all sorts of things that, just unfolded, if you like, as this journey came along. And it was very, very stressful time, as you can imagine. I'm trying to work still remotely, do a little bit as much as I can. And, but, caring for a child that needs so much of your time and attention takes its toll. And it culminated in me having a heart attack in November 2013, which was, pretty much a low point for us. Me in hospital, my wife at home, having to cope with everything. And it was at that point, I suppose, that we got then a referral into what we now know was sort of continuing care, which was really where we should have been referred much earlier, in my view. But it meant that we then went through an assessment process. During all of this, of course, we're having to cope with, acute episodes of care. We had open access to the local hospital, which meant we had unplanned admissions where we'd be going in. And we're trying to do everything we can just to keep the wheels turning, so to speak. And I suppose it was probably then another year of just sort of trundling along like that, starting to get a little bit of better support for her, realizing then that, she had made it past a year. She was nearly 2 now at this point, coming up for 3. What was life going to look like? We needed to adapt the house. It wasn't suitable for her needs. We couldn't get her upstairs. She was too heavy to lift. We had no specialist equipment in the house or whatever. But it was literally moving out into a rented property for 6 months while we gutted our property to build a kind of bedroom, wet room, utility room to service Olivia and her needs, really, putting in a hoist, putting in a rise and fall bath, making it a spacious area, leveling out, what was previous steps and making it wheelchair friendly and so on and so forth. We moved back into our house back end of 2015, September, I think it was. And by this point, we'd got a better care package now arranged through the social care program that we were part of with the local authority. We were getting continuing care support, which meant that we could have overnight care. Carers would come in at 10, go at 7, 5 nights a week, which was brilliant because it meant we just got a basic night's sleep, and we could just not have to worry about Olivia with her different medications and all these kinds of things that we were going through. But it was a heck of a journey. It turned out actually that Olivia had a genetic mutation through various DNA testing that we had done. It was a never recorded genetic mutation that had occurred. Never seen before, never seen since, as far as I'm aware. So she was a unique little girl in that respect. That took us to some helpful charities like Swan UK, for example. But I suppose what amazed me was that we were amazed just how uncoordinated the whole journey was, really, from none of the services really talking to each other. And it kind of fell to us to, to kind of keep tabs on what was happening and what was available to us, sourcing equipment, wheelchairs, vehicles, equipment, specialist seating, you name it. We had to kind of pull the whole thing together ourselves, really.
You became experts unintentionally. It was, obviously you had to go into a very practical mode from day one. But how do you balance the practical side of things with, the emotional side of things, and just trying to, get your head around the events, and then combine that with your life as it was before?
Great question. I mean, you have to just acknowledge that life is going to be different for you, and it changes all aspects of your life, quite honestly. My wife wasn't able to go back to work because she took on the role of full-time carer. I was very fortunate in that I worked for a large company that kind of recognized, the unique situation I was in and gave me the flexibility to kind of work remotely. I know that's what we all do now post-COVID and so on, but then it was good of them to do that and to support me. I'd been an employee of the company for quite a number of years, so they recognized who I was and what that was all about. And, that meant working odd hours to just fill in what I could at whatever times. But yeah, all aspects of our life were put on hold, quite frankly, because everything was geared around the care and support that Olivia needed. And
do you think, you mentioned you had a heart attack. Do you think that was the direct cause of that, was, the stress?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, because, in the sort of 12 months preceding that, we were really, just battling on our own. We were getting no real care or support from anybody outside. And I suppose it almost felt like, well, we'd been seeing that we were coping. And I do think there were problems in the sort of the way that the different agencies didn't connect and didn't refer us. And maybe, people had visited us in the home and thought, yeah, they're coping, they'll be okay. Because we just, British sort of stiff upper lip got on with it, But in reality, sleepless nights, stress, anxiety, worry, uncertainty about the future, the uncertainty about, adapting the house. Are we going to move? Do we need a bungalow? What are we going to do? Everything was just up for, review, if you like, and debate in the house. And I think it just took its toll, quite frankly. My wife also had suffered ill health. She suffered from epilepsy. She'd had a seizure earlier that year. She couldn't drive. It meant I was doing all the legwork in terms of getting to all these different hospital appointments and moving the sort of mobile hospital ward that Olivia became with us wherever we went, quite frankly. So it was tough.
There's so many parallels. I think it's interesting. My kind of starting point was slightly different. Although the birth was horrific, and that's as a spectator, I wasn't actively involved in the physical trauma of it all. But it's still, and I think that's true for a lot of people. William, after a couple of weeks in hospital and with treatment, he was discharged and came home. He struggled to feed from the outset, and then we battled. Feeding was the biggest issue, really, at that point, because the brain wasn't well formed. There was a lot of things that, in hindsight, we just didn't recognise or didn't know. And strangely enough, 5 months on, we were still, if you look back at pictures of William now, he was so small, so thin. He clearly was malnourished. He had failure to thrive, so he was under a general paediatrician. And then he started having what's called infantile spasms, which are a form of seizure. And they present in a certain way, and I could spot one a million miles off now, but they are very, very difficult to describe. But I actually diagnosed him from a YouTube video, strange as that may sound. And I took a video and I emailed the general paediatrician that he was under at the time and said, I think these are infantile spasms. And she immediately came back to me and just said, yeah, I think you're right. You need to come in and see neurology immediately. And then I think that start of the story that Simon was telling, almost that we had all this stress building up of not being able to feed, weight gain, weighing constantly, and having had 2 more children since, which I'm sure we'll come on to, we just didn't consider any of these things with them because it just happened. They were healthy and fine. There was a lot wrong with William, and it was visible in hindsight, but at the time we were just fighting through that. The infantile spasms, then you start getting into a treatment path in neurology. Those seizures change over time, and the diagnosis right from that point was really not very good. And you start moving forward, but at this point, William was still a baby, if you like, and the world's relatively well equipped for a baby. And then as he started getting older, and we were trying to consider ahead of time what he'd need in the future, but we didn't find out until later that there was only one other person that had the same genetic mutation that William had. So we didn't know how the world was going to look for us. We didn't know whether William was going to, whether it was going to be a very short life or whether he would live a long life. We knew it wasn't going to be normal, but with a lot of conditions that are more commonly understood, they follow a path within reason and you know what the future holds. And that just simply wasn't the case with William, and that was really hard to cope with. Navigating the system is a full-time job without any question. And there's an awful lot you don't know, but you don't know that you don't know. So forming bonds and groups and conversations with other parents that are living in this ecosystem of special educational needs for schooling, for example, is a network spawns out of all of these interactions, be it hospital appointments or hospices or school, and you learn from all of those people, but there isn't really ownership of you or your child from a health, a social care, an education. All of those, they're just disjointed, and you have to own and navigate all of that. And you're not an expert in any of those things, so it's really difficult. I think to your point about how you cope with that emotionally, and I definitely throw myself into the practicalities, so solving the problem that's immediate in front of you. And I think that's a coping mechanism. It's quite a functional coping mechanism, and then afterwards things catch up with me and I reflect on them, and I've learned better to cope with that. Distress is no doubt has a huge impact on you and your relationship. My wife's hair started falling out, not quite a heart attack, or seizures, but it takes its toll, and that's in itself quite hard to recognize because all of our focus was on William, trying to work out what to do, how to do it, what to do best, and you neglect all else because of that. I think after a while, and William's now coming up to 8, that's evolved, and we've had to take other decisions. We've had children, and you reflect on it and become better at it, but the problems are still there. It's still difficult to cope with, and it's still difficult to understand your situation fully and how you need to manage that. So I think that's really difficult, but definitely the practicalities are something you can own, you can take hold of, and you can do something about them. But actually, as much as they're necessary, they're a very small part of the overall well-being of you and your family and the child that you're trying to care for.
I guess from what you're saying, you have to just really get on with it and work it out for yourself. But looking back, what do you wish you'd known then that you know now? During
our journey, I met other families through different services that we were linked into or different organisations or whatever. And for me personally, I took it upon myself to kind of introduce myself and go and talk to some of these other parents and just form friendship groups out of that. And I was quite lucky because locally, it's amazing. Within a relatively small geographic area, there were 3 or 4 other families that were on a similar pathway to us. Some were slightly older children, some were slightly younger. But I wish I'd done that sooner in my journey. Probably if we'd been referred into some of the services at an earlier age and not missed that kind of first 12, 18 months, that would have been my opportunity to link in quicker and sooner to people. But I'm glad I did do that. It meant that we formed our own sort of social group, and we would meet up, once every month or 2 for a social catch up. It was never more than a beer and a bite to eat sometimes, but it was good to meet like-minded dads who were experiencing the same sort of challenges that I was as a dad and as a family. I just wish I'd met them a bit sooner, really. That was all. They were a great source of information, both in terms of the practical stuff, which blokes are always pretty good at, aren't they? You know, give me a problem and I'll fix it. But also in terms of how they were coping in their relationships with their respective wives and girlfriends, what impact it was having on the wider family. You know, there were some other lessons that we all learnt from each other, I hope and think, which helped, you know. So it's the old adage, just get out there and talk to people.
Was there any kind of formal support network, or was it something you kind of created as you went along through the people that you met?
Yeah, it was an informal thing, really. You know, we swapped phone numbers. I think we had a little Facebook group going on probably in the days before WhatsApp, because we're going back a couple of years. But, you know, that was kind of it, really. It was a fairly informal thing, but we did all get something from that, I think, as we met. And, you know, it was just the dads, and it was no more than once every month or two. But I used to thoroughly enjoy that interaction. I got a lot from that.
I think there's two things. I think the world that you're trying to navigate needs to be better orchestrated by somebody in a professional sense. But then, because you're responsible, you end up having to be responsible, even for things that seem trivial to most people, like what equipment you need and all of those things. What ends up happening is you learn from other people within that social group, as Simon described it, and then you take that to the professional, be it an occupational therapist or a physiotherapist, and says, what about this? And then they typically, at that point, pick it up and go, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's very logical. But the onus is on you to do that. And the only way you find that out is from other people. So I think that a social group is really important from an emotional point of view and just an understanding point of view. But I think the practical side of things and where the profession, how that interfaces into the professional and healthcare world isn't right, but it's the way that it is at the moment. So I agree that it's really important and that you jump onto that and you use it how you want. I know not everybody wants to do it, and it depends what stage they're in and in the process and how they're coping with that. And I think it's really, really valid and important to do that. But I'm still not convinced that the system works for people in really complex situations like us. And I don't think we should rely on that, fix that, because I think it's far more important that that's there from a well-being and emotional support network, as opposed to being that same old thing where you can fall back on the practicalities and talk about wheelchairs for days on end. But I think there's a need for that as well.
Based on your experience, what advice would you offer to those people listening who have a child with life-limiting condition and special needs?
I would strongly urge them to meet other parents and carers. You know, look at what the situation is around you with other children in a similar environment, really, and just build that informal network. That's where you'll get your best resource. That's where you'll find your most important allies that can share their experiences, good, bad, or indifferent, and learn from that. And also, don't be afraid to share your own journey. I was more than happy to kind of, you know, open up from a practical point of view and, you know, share my own sort of journey with other chaps that were in this particular group. You know, we hosted them on a sort of building site visit when we were in the middle of our building works, because some of them were about to commence on a similar journey. And I thought, yeah, great. You know, if I'd had the opportunity to do that myself, I would have really welcomed that. So anything we could have done just to kind of give people that extra bit of inside information and knowledge and experience, really, that's what I would recommend people do.
I would agree with that. And similarly, I think you seek out those people, and I think you can learn a lot from that. And I think talking about your own experiences and your own story is a really important thing for the people you're talking to, but also for yourself, without any question. I think there's a degree of catharsis that comes with that process. I would also say that you kind of, it sounds, whether it's a therapy conversation or a non-therapy conversation, certainly for me it was important that you kind of took time out and reflected and spent time talking. So I needed to spend time talking to my wife. You know, outside of the practicalities of what decisions do you think we should take on anticonvulsive medications? What adaptations do we need to have made to the house? Where are we going to put a lift? All those kind of conversations happened because they were necessary. And it was only later on that really we both recognised in ourselves, particularly that I approach things very differently to how my wife does, not rightly or wrongly, just very differently, and that somehow that we needed to make a conscious and proactive decision to speak, about other things. And I think that's true of all parents. There's cliches of date nights and all these sort of things, but there's a reason for that as well. It's harder in my experience to do that when there is so many things that are just needing to being done, that it can take away from the opportunity, or at least the headspace, to be able to actively have those conversations and work on yourselves and your relationship and everything else outside of the battle that you're fighting day in, day out, just to get by.
So how did your experience impact the decision to have any more children?
Yeah, so obviously the situation we found ourselves in with Olivia and being told that she was life limited meant that we were going to have ultimately not the outcome we were expecting. So we thought about this, and we decided that we wanted to try for another baby. So we knew there was a risk, but because of the genetic malformation that Olivia had, we'd had various tests done and so on. And we went for consultant-led care. We were lucky enough to fall pregnant fairly quickly, and it was very much a sort of a conscious decision that we wanted to go on and have another child. So we were fortunate enough that our daughter Jessica was born in the summer of 2015. So Olivia was still around. That was a very successful natural birth and a completely different experience to the one that we'd had a couple of years earlier with Olivia. So Jessica will be 8 this summer. She was 15 months old when Olivia sadly passed in October 16, but she remembers a little sister. There's plenty of memories of her around the house, as you can well imagine. It was probably one of the key decisions that we took to go on, and all of those milestones and things that Olivia didn't reach, we now live through Jessica, and she's absolutely delightful. So best decision we ever made.
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult decision. So with William, we did something very illogical. So we were fortunate, I suppose, that we had some results from the 100,000 Genome Project, which was happening at the same time as we were thinking about having a second child, or whether we should have a second child, and whether we could give William the care that he needed, as well as care for another child, and complex scenarios that we went through with ourselves and with each other, trying to work it out. But we got some results. We ended up having the results being that there was a very rare mutation. It was almost certainly not going to happen again, just because it was a mutation. But you can't. There's no certainty around it, and the mindset and the logic is really clear. The risk of having an amniocentesis to test this far higher than having a repeat of William's condition, which was almost impossible. Or that was the understanding we had of it at the time, and the way that it was presented to us. But we still had the testing, because the consequences of having 2 people like William would be that it would be, I think, practically impossible for us to care for both of them effectively. So we had the testing, and then our second child, Beatrice, was born. She's now 4 years old. And then we kind of went through the whole thing again, and it was a little bit easier, I suppose, because we knew the same information. There was a few things that didn't go quite to plan in terms of the way that it was communicated and how we interacted with the healthcare professionals, and the communication pathways. But we didn't want Beatrice to only know life with William. We thought a neurotypical sibling would be good. So we went through the whole thing again, and we had the testing again with the risks associated with it, and everything was fine, as you'd expect it to have been if you follow the data. And then Charlie was born, and he's 18 months old now. But it was a very stressful and difficult decision to take, and it was all's well because it ended well, but it was a very stressful time for us both. And then now it's fabulous. I'm so amazed every day by William has seizures every single day, sometimes hundreds in a day. And children are amazing. They just get on with it. They understand it really quickly. They're way smarter than we often give them credit for. And I think they bring a healthier dynamic to our family and all of our relationships. William's, his parents, siblings, all of us together are better off because we did make that decision. But it was a very, very difficult decision to take at the time. I think in general, kids are just great with kids with differences and disabilities. If a kid parents will look strangely at William, and I'm sure same for you, Simon, and not necessarily engage or ask. Whereas a kid will come up to you and we'll be feeding William, putting some food through his feeding tube, and they'll go, "Oh, what's that?" And to a child, they'll just ask you, and you go, "Oh, it's a bit like a straw, because he can't eat through his mouth." And the kid will just be like, "Fine, understand that," and move on. And adults just don't do that.
So, Gareth, based on your experience and I guess frustration with the existing food choices available for use with a feeding tube for William, you've now developed an organic real food brand to help everybody who's using a blended diet. So tell us about Wilbo's Blends.
Yeah, sure. So, and it probably comes from that kind of practical side of things, and kind of one of the responsibilities I took on was it happened to be that like feeding William was really not as straightforward as most people would think it is. And similar to Simon, William was given his first NG tube when he was 5 months old. And at that point, we were in a very dark place, and we were moving from appointment to appointment, specialist to specialist. The list was endless. And we were given formula, which doesn't sound too abstract, really, for a child. And babies, particularly, you consider those things to be logical. And he was always likely, we knew at that point, always likely to not be able to eat orally. And we were given, as is most people, a load of formula feeds, NG tubes. He later had a gastrostomy, which made it a little bit easier because that's a tube that goes straight into his stomach, and a pump, and just told how to use all of this stuff. And that's what William was going to eat for the rest of his life. And at the time, it was just a fait accompli. Here we go. This is how you do it. This is what enteral nutrition looks like. And we went home and started that process and got used to it. But William had all sorts of problems with gastrointestinal side effects. So he had diarrhea as well as being constipated on occasion. He had terrible reflux, which, is just vomiting all the time. And that has consequences on his overall health and everything else. And this carried on for a while. When somebody has a baby and they kind of have a little bit of a cough up, or however you want to phrase it, and they pass you a muslin, that's one thing. We didn't leave the house. We didn't go anywhere without a bucket because William would be vomiting into it. And I remember there was this moment of realization for me when I was taking a delivery of boxes and boxes of this formula, and you look at the ingredient list and it is, you wouldn't eat it. You just wouldn't go anywhere near it. And then if you're having that for every meal for your whole life, you just look at it and go, that's got to have huge consequences, especially when we look at the rest of our lives where we're told how important a well-balanced diet is, and lots of fruit and veg and all those things, which is without doubt true. That just switches if you're requiring enteral nutrition, or for most people it does. It means, okay, forget everything that we all understand to be a healthy diet, and you're now having this ultra-processed formula and artificial nutrition for everything. But when I had that moment of realization, I was like, this doesn't make any sense at all. There must be something else. I went out and I did some research, and I found out about this idea of just a blended diet, which is you take normal food and you blend it. As simple as that, really. It is a little bit more complicated than that. But the world has not really, or had not really, cottoned on to how much this group benefit from real food, and people were just following this medical route. So we did a lot more research. We spoke to our dietitian that we were under and our speech and language therapy, the pediatricians, and they were actually relatively supportive. And I say that kind of cautiously because a lot aren't, or a lot weren't at the time. This was 4 years ago. And we started the blended diet, and almost overnight, he improved his reflux, his bowel movements, everything just got better. And he was just better. He looked better. He was healthier. His weight gain was better. But there's an awful lot of work that goes into doing a blended diet as well. And you've got to get the viscosity right. You've got to calculate nutrition. You've got to make sure that you're feeding a healthy diet. Volume tolerance is difficult if you've never eaten food because you're not weaning like a baby. Typically, if you're older. And there wasn't an awful lot of resource available of how to do it. So you ended up falling into social media and Facebook groups where there was people doing this, and they had a lot of experience, and it was fabulous. And the Blended Diet UK Facebook group is an amazing group, amazing community with great resources, and we learned an awful lot from those. And the change in William was so dramatic. I became very evangelical about the benefits of it and was talking to anybody else that was in a similar situation to us about it. And I decided that because it's difficult, because there isn't enough in the way of resource to support people doing it, somebody needed to do something about it, and they weren't. So I decided that we were going to do it. And I sat in the kitchen, I had a conversation with my wife just saying, look, this is kind of what I think and what we need to do about it. And clearly she'd seen the benefits and everything that happened in William just as I had. And it was one of those ones where it got out of hand, I suppose. And we spent a lot of time, a lot of effort doing research, engaging professionals, building effectively a business, and then conducting all the research and development, spending hundreds of thousands of pounds, and getting investors to help us and partners involved to enable us to do it, to bring a product that was fit for purpose and a resource network behind it to provide that information, and then telling people about it. And it was an awful lot of work, and it still is, but the feedback that we get is overwhelming, that it's making the same difference to hundreds of people like us, and that number's growing all the time. In hindsight, sometimes people say, if I knew how much and how difficult it would be, you'd never have started it. That's definitely not the case for us. We didn't know how difficult it was going to be. We didn't know how hard it was going to be and how time consuming, but the benefits are overwhelming, and we're helping so many people with it. And it's something I'm incredibly proud of. And it's named after William as Wilbo's Blends, which he's affectionately known as, and it's going from strength to strength at the moment.
I really don't know how you've managed to find time to fit in building a business empire with everything else. Could you just explain perhaps why the food available for feeding tubes has just not evolved over time?
There's probably a confluence of a number of different things, really. The concept of enteral nutrition is very, very old. The first gastrostomy was done in kind of 1875, I think, or something like that. But what's happened is the commercial formulas started to be developed in the 70s, and they've just become the de facto. There's no research evidence to show that they're any good, because at the time that they were developed, the world of research and empirical evidence to bring a product like that to market just didn't exist. And it just became the de facto and moved on and on and on until the point nobody can remember anything different than commercial formula. I think the blended diet then has started to get probably a lot more traction and thought given to it, because there's probably a few things. The quality of the home blending equipment, to buy a blender is obviously a lot easier now than it was 20, 30 years ago. And also medical science has moved on, so people that have got the long-term requirement for enteral nutrition, there's more people of them living for longer. And there's, for example, in oncology with chemotherapy treatments, people are having gastrostomies preemptively for known eating problems as a result of the chemotherapy or radiation treatments that they're going through. So there's a greater requirement. But what's really interesting is, and I speak to doctors and all sorts of health professionals all of the time. And when you just step back from the day-to-day of what everybody knows in a clinical setting and just get people to think and explain the situation, which is, if you eat food and you eat a healthy diet, you are healthier. And the fact that there's a feeding tube involved is irrelevant, because that's not a reason. That is not a clinical reason for somebody not to have real food. In most cases, there are special cases where really specialized nutrition is required. And as soon as you explain that to somebody and say, real food's really better for you, everybody goes, of course it is. It's really logical. I remember presenting to a team of gastrosurgeons, and the realization was, it's just so intrinsically logical and obvious to anybody. It's just not been given the thought time, because the default has always been the default and always will be the default until somebody does something about it, which is really where Wilbo's Blends comes from, in just changing the story and explaining the thing that we all already know.
So a real disruptor, really. Disrupting traditional way of doing things. And do you think, can you see this, changing, for example, NHS procurement and how they, as standard, provide, or the type of food that they provide?
Yeah, it already is starting to happen. So I've been asked to present at the Royal College of Paediatrics and Children's Health annual conference this year, in fact, next week, which is, I think, tribute to the recognition from important bodies, professional bodies, that this is something that needs to be understood better. I guess I'm probably a little bit more evangelical and a bit blunter in the way that I describe it, which is, most people say, we need to do more research to see how this is. And a lot of the research has been done now, but all of the research is saying, the empirical academic research and clinical research is all saying, we need to see if it's okay to eat food. That's the research question. I'm being facetious, but bluntly, food's fine. I've checked. I've eaten loads of it and I've been fine most of the time. I've made some bad decisions perhaps on occasion, but food's fine. We don't need to do that. What we do need to do research in is how to support people, how to do it well. What is the right nutritional profile of these meals? How do you create resources to enable people to calculate those things, and having those allied health professionals supporting them, like dietitians, on how to do it well rather than whether we should do it or not, is really the next step. But I get contacted around Wilbo's Blends by hospitals. The first hospital in the UK is going to start buying it soon, we're told, and we're speaking to a number of others. So that is changing. But when we work with a health economist, an NHS health economist in Manchester that's associated with Manchester University, they've calculated that it'll save the NHS £300 million a year, which is really important to all of us that require, when we can see the budget conversation around healthcare all the time. But the more powerful evidence is how quickly people get out of hospital, how quickly they recover. So the patient experience is just vastly improved. And the thing that I think, when I look at it holistically, and when I speak to other people in a similar situation to me, is the other impacts of what a real food diet can do. William sits and has Christmas dinner with us. He eats with us all the time. He sits at the table with his siblings. That's really important. And he has birthday cake and it gets blended up and he has it like anybody else would. And that social aspect of food is everywhere in our society. And as soon as you medicalize that, it has a huge impact on perhaps the person themselves, their family, their carers, their friends, everybody. There's a huge knock on to that. And they're areas that do also require more research. So from a health point of view, it's incredibly important, but it's far reaching beyond that as well.
Brilliant. Well, look, Simon, Gareth, thank you so much for being open, sharing your experiences, not just for people who perhaps, have no knowledge of having a child with a life-limiting condition, but to those out there who are experiencing this, and hopefully your words have helped and provided some guidance there as well. So thank you very much, both of you.
Yeah, thank you. It's great that you've put this together as well, Phil.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. It's been really good.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Midlife Men. If you'd like to find out more about the charity that Simon referenced, Swan UK, then visit the website undiagnosed.org.uk. Or if you'd like to find out more about Wilbo's blends, or even shop for some of their organic real food meals, then visit wilbosblends.co.uk. If you have a suggestion for a topic you'd like us to cover in the podcast, or if you have a story you'd like to share, then please contact me either on Twitter @midlifemen or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. Join me next time when we talk to other midlife men about their stories, and maybe you'll find that they resonate with you. Thank you.